Evening, guys. I'm here to talk about the causes of the Cold War, and here's a short little introduction to clarify what exactly the Cold War meant. Okay, because I think a lot of students they struggle to understand the concept of the Cold War. Okay, so I've provided a definition over here, which you can find online, and I'm going to break this definition down in order to give you a better idea of what the Cold War actually meant. Okay, so firstly, it says the Cold War was a period of East-West competition, tension, and conflict short of full-scale war, characterized by mutual perceptions of hostile intention between military, political alliances, or blocs. Alright, so yeah, it's quite a wordy definition over here, but what we're going to do now is to break this definition down into smaller chunks, and I'll explain these with various examples. Okay, so firstly, we look at East-West competition. Okay, what do we mean by East-West competition? Okay, firstly, of course, I think most of you would know by now the Cold War was basically characterized by conflict between the two superpowers which were left standing after World War II. So essentially, it dealt with the USA over here against the USSR. Okay, the two main superpowers which emerged at the end of World War II. Alright, and also when we look at East-West competition, we can look at the competition between the two ideologies that these two superpowers adhered to. So of course, the USA over here were strong supporters of capitalism and democracy at the same time. However, the USSR over here, as represented by the bear, it basically supported the idea of communism, okay, as represented by the hammer and the sickle over here. Okay, so basically a conflict of ideologies also characterized the Cold War. Okay, we're gonna look at the characteristics of communism and capitalism later on. Okay, but essentially, it was both a conflict between two superpowers and between two main ideologies over here. Alright, there was also a period of tension, and as we have looked through the various chapters, okay, the tension could be a result of the nuclear arms race. So both parties building up their nuclear arsenals, which caused mutual feelings of threat, for example, which led to great tension between these two superpowers. Also, hostile rhetoric, okay, basically hostile words, okay, that both the two superpowers said publicly, which basically caused one another to feel threatened or offended, which provoked both superpowers. And these words that were very hostile also heightened tensions between the two superpowers. And as you see over here, it basically shows Truman basically delivering his Truman Doctrine speech, which we'll talk about later on. And Truman himself, by making this speech, basically triggered strong reactions over here in the communist world. Alright, and also other provocative actions, for example, as you can see over here, if you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro over here basically forming an alliance with Khrushchev over here. And how was this provocative? As we can remember, Cuba was just 150 kilometers away from the USA, and by forming an alliance with the Soviet Union, what Khrushchev did kind of provoked the USA to feeling threatened. Okay, simply because there's a communist country as its neighbor, and he felt threatened um, you know, by Cuba itself. Okay, more on that later on. We look at chapter 3, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and conflict short of full-scale war. Okay, so what we saw, we didn't have full-scale war between the USA and the USSR. They didn't fight full-scale battles against one another. However, what happened during the course of the Cold War were these things called proxy wars. Alright, which were basically these two superpowers fighting in a way in other territories, so as we saw in Korea over here, basically the USA supporting South Korea, and the Russians or the USSR supporting the North Koreans. So essentially, although they didn't technically engage in direct conflict, okay, they were actually in conflict in an indirect manner through other um, countries, through other parties. All right, and of course Vietnam, where the USA basically supported South Vietnam in its fight against North Vietnam. Okay, later on. So although they did not directly fight one another, they actually engaged in conflict through other territories. Um, the Cold War was characterized by mutual perceptions of hostile intention. So, what do we mean by mutual perceptions? It basically means how the superpowers saw one another, and throughout the course of the Cold War, both superpowers were very inclined to judge one another's actions and judge them to be hostile actions, basically provocative actions, actions that were not mutually beneficial to one another. So, for example, something the USA uh, did would have been seen by the Soviets as threatening or hostile towards their own security. Okay, and we saw that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, where when Khrushchev decided to plant missiles in Cuba, although he claimed it was for defensive purposes, the USA actually felt that no, it wasn't defensive, but it was actually offensive in nature. Okay, so basically, it was characterized by a period of strong mutual suspicion between the two superpowers. And finally, between military political alliances or blocs. Okay, what do we mean by alliances or blocs? Essentially, one example was that very, very clear economic blocs were formed in Europe itself or throughout the world itself. So you had basically Europe, for example, divided into two allies of the USA, for example, France, Britain, which basically received aid from the Marshall Plan supported by the USA, and you had the communist bloc countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia. Okay, these were considered Soviet satellite states, and basically they received instructions and economic coordination from the Comecon. Okay, more on that later. And basically in Europe, you see two very clear economic blocs. Okay, one influenced by the USA, and one influenced by the Soviet Union. And you didn't just have economic blocs; you also had military blocs. Okay, essentially when the NATO, which was helmed by the Western Allies and the USA, okay, they formed in a promise to protect one another in case they were invaded, versus the Warsaw Pact, which was basically made up of the Soviet Union and its satellite states like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, for example. Alright, so two very clear economic blocs and two very clear military blocs as well. Okay, so basically these things characterized the Cold War. So when we talk about the Cold War, okay, think about the competition between the two superpowers, the great tensions that were generated during the course of the Cold War, okay, how the two superpowers fell into conflict with one another, and how each other's actions were deemed as hostile to one another. Okay, so essentially, the Cold War, although it fell short of a full-scale war, okay, it was really characterized by great tensions between the two superpowers. So, when you look at the developments before the Cold War began and during the Cold War itself, think about how these contributed to all these aspects that we have talked about over here. Okay, so yeah, here's just a short summary of what the Cold War actually meant. Okay, and we're going to look at how the Cold War came about in this chapter itself. So now that we've looked at the concept of the Cold War, we're going to think about how the Cold War itself started. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to provide you with some background on the Cold War. Then I'm going to talk about ideological conflict, basically the long-term causes of the Cold War. And we're going to look at World War II itself. What happened during World War II which caused the USSR and, for example, the USA and its Western allies from being allies to becoming adversaries at the end of World War II. And we're going to look at post-war competition, so immediately after the war, what happened and how certain events caused, the two allies to become two adversaries. And finally, we're going to look at how the Cold War manifested itself. So basically, what shape did the Cold War take? What kind of form did the Cold War conflict take? Okay, and firstly, I'm going to start with background. Okay, so we look at background basically. As mentioned previously in the PowerPoint slides, the Cold War itself was characterized by tensions between the USA and the USSR. And when we talk about tensions, the tensions which uh, resulted between these two superpowers basically intensified during the course of the Cold War. And when we look at the various events, think about how these tensions were intensified. Okay, so if we think about the Cold War as a period of great tensions between the two superpowers, look at how each event that we're going to talk about later intensified these tensions and hence caused the Cold War between the two superpowers. Okay, so essentially the conflicts here were, like for example, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Okay, all these were a result of intensifying tensions between the superpowers, and we're going to look at these conflicts later on. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background, a summary of what the Cold War actually was. So basically, a period of great tensions between the two superpowers. Alright, so we look at ideological conflict between the two superpowers, which led to the Cold War, which played a very, very big part during the course of the Cold War itself. So, okay, when we think about ideological conflict, basically it falls under the long term. Okay, it's set basically the base for conflicts between the two superpowers. So first we're going to look at the Russian revolutions in 1917, essentially when the Tsar, the King of Russia, was overthrown, and eventually the monarchy in Russia was replaced with a communist dictatorship. Okay, so basically the Russian revolutions in 1917 basically happened during World War One, and it involved uh, communist Russia, which resulted from the revolutions. Communist Russia had a vision that was opposed to the ideology of Western Europe and the USA. Essentially, it was communism as upheld by Russia versus democracy and capitalism as embodied by Western Europe, countries like France, countries like Britain, and of course the USA itself. And of course, during the after Russian revolutions, there was a Russian Civil War, and countries like Britain and the USA they actually sent manpower over to Russia to fight on the side of the whites who were basically fighting against the communist um, army actually. Okay, so essentially they were so fearful of the spread of communism. Okay, because Russia, after all, was the first country to have been successfully turned into a communist state. Okay, so because of the Russian revolutions, okay, which were successful, um, and of course the Soviet Union became what was created in 1922 after the successful creation of okay, sorry for the interruption. Yeah, I had something to attend to, but yeah, essentially, sorry, back to this. The spread of communism was basically seen as a real threat. Okay, after Russia had fallen to communism, and basically the Western democratic countries viewed communism with tremendous suspicion. And like I said, okay, they sent troops in to help the whites during the Russian Civil War. And in response, Lenin, who was the leader of Communist Russia, set up the Comintern or the Communist International. And what he did was to basically not just defend communism, but he created the Comintern to help to spread communism around the world. And hence, like I said, the USSR was formed in 1922, and this eventually uh, caused great tension because the USA did not formally recognize the USSR till 1933, about 11 years later. And the USSR, because the major countries like Britain and the USA and France, they were also suspicious of the USSR, the USSR was only allowed to join the League of Nations in 1934, and this was after the withdrawal of both Germany and Japan, simply because the powers saw the USSR as a potential ally, against these two powers when they left, and also to basically back the LON up with its resources and its manpower, okay, its support essentially. Okay, so basically there was a great rivalry between the West and the East in this sense, like we talked about just now when we looked at the concept. So, what was the impact of this ideological conflict between uh, the Western Allies and the USA versus the Soviet Union? Essentially, the history of mutual distrust, okay, which can be traced back to the Russian revolutions in 1917, basically set the stage for the Cold War because uh, it basically presented a potential for conflict. Okay, essentially, from the very, very fundamentals, on the very, very fundamentals, both the Western Allies slash the USA could not agree with the USSR, and therefore this basis of disagreement um, set the foundations for the Cold War itself. So when we look at ideological conflict, we think about an irreversible kind of conflict between these countries, simply because from the very basis, both of them couldn't agree on how countries should be run. Okay, so and basically the fears of the spread of communism, a system that was deemed incompatible and deemed very uh, uh, evil on the part of the USA and the Western Allies, basically made them have these irreconcilable differences with the Soviet Union. Alright, so next we're going to look at number two, basically the medium term causes of the Cold War. We're going to look at events during World War II itself and how these contributed to the outbreak of the Cold War later on. Okay, so firstly we'll look at the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So if you remember the Nazi-Soviet Pact that was signed in 1939, just shortly before the Nazi invasion of Poland, which caused the World War II, what it did was to increase the mutual distrust between the Western Allies and the USSR, simply because Stalin, had agreed to sign a pact with the Nazis. Okay, and this basically made the Western powers very distrustful of Stalin himself, and not just that, there was a perceived delay in the opening of the second front. So if I were to show a picture, okay, essentially during the war itself, we look at okay, this picture over here. Okay, what happened was that okay, I'm going to show you later on, but the Soviet Union over here was basically fighting with okay, let me find a better picture, sorry about this. Yeah, okay, essentially the Soviet Union, as you see over here, okay, was basically from June 1941 was engaged in a full-scale battle against Nazi Germany. And what happened was, so there was a lot of fighting going on here, okay, because the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union by surprise in 1941, and the Soviet Union wasn't exactly 100% prepared to deal with the sudden Nazi invasion, and as a result, it suffered a lot of casualties. And when the USA entered the war later on in 1941, in December 1941, about 6 months later, um, the USA basically formed an alliance with the Soviet Union as part, of the Allied forces as we now know of today. And essentially, the Nazis continued fighting with the Soviet Union, okay, all the way almost to the end of the war. Okay, on this front, the Nazi advances were very fast, very brutal, very deadly. Although they came to a standstill later on because of the cold Soviet winters, which we learned about last year. However, when the USA entered, because Stalin was suffering so much, okay, in terms of the Russians suffering tremendous losses on their home front, defending against the Nazis. Okay, what Stalin really hoped for was for the USA to come this way and open up a second front over here to basically divide German attention. Okay, to not just I'm going to represent German attention with yellow. So Germans wouldn't. Okay, oops. Okay, the Germans wouldn't just be fighting here. Okay, they would also have to defend themselves against. Okay, so basically, yeah, against the allied powers. The other allied powers like the USA, Britain, for example. If the USA had landed and opened a second front over here, and this will help to relieve Stalin of the pressure that he was facing over here. Okay, which would have helped Stalin tremendously. So from the very beginning, Stalin was already requesting for such help, the opening of this second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. However, what happened was there was a perceived delay in the opening of the second front, and although Stalin urged the Allies to open a second front in France, this second front over here that we talked about over here, was not opened till 1944 with the D-Day landings itself. And basically the Allies, they wanted a higher chance of success and therefore delayed um, the invasion of Normandy, basically the D-Day landings, for about 3 years actually. And however, although the Allies saw it as a very smart move in order to make sure that they're 100% ready before they launched that invasion to open the second front, the Soviets, however, did not really see it as such. They saw the delay, in fact, as an attempt by the Allies to use Germany to weaken or destroy the Soviet Union. So basically, Stalin felt that the USA was trying to get Germany and the Soviet Union to weaken themselves so much so that eventually in the post-war world, the USA will be able to gain influence in Europe very, very easily. And on the other hand, the Western Allies were also very suspicious of the Soviets because, you remember that the Soviets had already signed a Nazi-Soviet pact before the war started. Even during the course of the war, the Americans, for example, they felt that there was a chance that the Soviets would sign a separate peace with Hitler over here. So basically to stop the war over here so that Hitler will be able to focus on this part. So although I was never really on the cards in terms of Stalin believing Hitler again, the Allies couldn't help but feel this strong sense of suspicion after what happened during the Nazi-Soviet pact. Okay, and what was the impact of the perceived delay in the opening of the second front? Okay, essentially, this created a very, very uneasy alliance throughout the course of World War II. And although Britain never really fell to the Germans, okay, they were still defending on that side. Stalin and Russia itself basically faced most of the pressure from June 1941 onwards. And basically, these mutual suspicions that we looked at over here set the stage for the Cold War, and this basically contributed to the atmosphere of historical distrust that we looked at over here with differences in ideology. So not just differences in ideology, yet differences in understanding over World War II strategy. And because of this suspicion that existed between the two superpowers, it basically set the stage for the Cold War and for tensions to increase later on. However, because they were still fighting against a common enemy, they still remained as allies in spite of these suspicions. Okay, so in addition to the perceived delay of the opening of the second front, you also had disagreements during negotiations, and we're going to focus on wartime conferences, so basically wartime meetings between the big powers during World War II itself. So when we look at we're going to look at two main conferences, the Yalta Conference and also the Potsdam Conference, both in 1945 towards the end of World War II. The Yalta Conference was basically held in Crimea, as we know of today, and basically its aim was to finalize strategies against the Nazis. At this time, the Nazis were still fighting, although at this time there wasn't much doubt that the Nazis were going to lose, were going to be defeated sooner or later. So basically, the Allies, the big three, the USSR, America, and Britain gathered in Yalta, and basically they discussed post-war arrangements because they knew that the Nazis were going to be defeated sooner or later, at least in Europe. Okay, and what happened was that the aims were actually different across the board. Okay, the Soviet Union, its main priority was to secure post-war security. Okay, having been invaded in World War One and in World War Two, the Soviet Union did not want to be invaded again. So, one its main priority was to basically secure its own borders, secure its country from future invasions. Britain, knowing that its power was waning, the fact that it had been defeated in places like uh, Southeast Asia during World War Two, felt that it couldn't sustain itself as a superpower after the end of the war, and therefore Churchill, the British Prime Minister, sought to forge a close relationship with the USA. The USA at this time was still under President Franklin Roosevelt. They basically sought peace, security, and freedom for all. Okay, after World War Two. Okay, we're going to look at how this would manifest itself later on. And moreover, it's important to note that the Western allies, Britain, the USA, they needed the Soviet Union's help. After all, the Soviet Union had a massive army, needed the Soviet Union's help to defeat Japan. Although Hitler looked like he was going to be defeated very soon, sooner or later, it wasn't as clear-cut in Japan. And at this time, you must remember that the atomic bomb had not been invented. And the Japanese at this time didn't look like they were going to be defeated easily at all. Okay, so they wanted the Soviet Union to come in to support the Allies in fighting against Japan in the Asia Pacific. And during Yalta itself, you saw a lot of concessions being made to Stalin. Okay, we're going to look at what these concessions were soon. Okay, so what was agreed at Yalta? Okay, essentially, all territories were to be freed from Nazi occupations, from the Nazi occupation, were to hold free elections. Alright, and Germany itself was to be divided into four main zones. Okay, so we're going to look at how Germany was divided later on. Okay, and the borders would be redrawn in Europe, with the Soviet Union given parts of Poland, and then Poland would be compensated with parts of Germany. So remember when I spoke to you guys about Wrocław, which was previously Breslau. Okay, that was an example of the place which initially belonged to the Germans, but after World War II belonged to Poland. Okay, and finally, because the League of Nations had been so unsuccessful, the United Nations, the UN, would be created to replace the League of Nations at the end of the war. So these were the four main issues that were agreed on during the Yalta Conference. However, there were disagreements between the powers which attended the Yalta Conference. And firstly, we look at the issue of Europe itself. The Western allies, countries like Britain, countries like the USA, okay, who sat there at the Yalta Conference, they believed that the economy of Europe must be revitalized to prevent the spread of communist influences. So there's a very strong belief on the part of the USA, for example, that the poorer the country is, the more susceptible it would be to communist influences. And remember, they were really suspicious of communism and really did not want communism to spread. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, however, wanted to build a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, so essentially to establish governments very similar to the one that they have in the USSR, in Eastern Europe itself, and have a very strong influence over these governments, these countries in Eastern Europe, in order to ensure that they would serve to meet the security needs of the Soviet Union. Okay, we look at what this meant later on when we look at the map. And also Germany. Okay, they disagreed over the issue of Germany. Essentially, the Western Allies wanted to ensure that Germany would recover economically, again to prevent the spread of communist influences in Germany. However, the Soviet Union, having been invaded by Germany twice already in the 20th century, wanted to keep Germany weak so that they would pose no future threat to the Soviet Union. And finally, on the issue of Poland, okay, the Western Allies, remember, because Poland was freed from Nazi occupation, the Western Allies wanted to ensure that free elections were to be held would be held in Poland itself. Okay, so essentially to allow the Polish people to choose their own government. However, the Soviet Union didn't really agree with this. They wanted the Polish government to be under Soviet control. And the issue with this is that with this main conflict is that the Polish people actually didn't really like the Soviet Union after what the Soviet Union did to Poland. Remember that the Soviet Union actually invaded Poland in after the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed. So basically, to have a Polish government under Soviet control um, would not have been very well received by the Polish people. Okay, so we're going to see how the Soviets actually did that later on. So all these disagreements basically had a great impact on the relationship between the two superpowers. Okay, essentially these differing goals that we've looked at over here, okay, they added to pre-existing tensions. So remember, during the course of the war, because of, for example, the perceived delay of the Second Front, the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, these created tensions. But the fact that the two superpowers could not agree to certain things, certain post-war arrangements, basically added to the pre-existing tensions between both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Okay, so again, increasing tensions contributed to the eventual outbreak of the Cold War. Okay, next we're going to look at the Potsdam Conference. Okay, this conference was held in Potsdam, which is actually part of Germany. Okay, relatively near Berlin actually. Okay, so what happened during the Potsdam Conference was the main aim of the Potsdam Conference was to discuss the post-war order. Okay, because Germany by this time had been defeated, and Japan looked like they were going to be defeated sooner or later as well. So a little bit about the situation, okay, which surround the context of the Potsdam Conference. Essentially, by this time, the Soviets had established a communist government in Poland. So obviously, free elections, which were what the Western Allies wanted, were not really held in Poland at this time. So the Soviets took basically the liberty to establish a communist government in Poland. And also at this time, the USA had developed the atomic bomb. And so, because they understood the devastating potential of the atomic bomb and how it could be used on Japan, they found that they no longer needed Soviet help against Japan. So they no longer needed to rely on the Soviets. So of course, they would be less likely to give in to Soviet demands because they didn't need the Soviet Union anymore. Okay, let's look at what was agreed at Potsdam. Essentially, the denazification of Germany, to remove all Nazi elements for Germany, that was one point that was agreed on. And also, Germany would be divided into 4 main zones. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Okay, so when we look at Germany and what Potsdam basically resulted in was the division of Germany. Okay, and this is what was agreed. Basically, Germany would be divided into 4 zones, and each uh, zone would be controlled by one particular country. So you get the green part over here, which was essentially the British sector of Germany. You have the French sector over here, and in pink you have the American sector. And this on this part over here, the yellow part, was basically controlled by the Soviet Union. So if you look at Germany itself, you realize that about 2/3 of Germany um, was under the influence and under the direct control of the Western Allies actually. Okay, so this is what was agreed, and of course Berlin itself, which was the capital of Germany, would be itself divided into four parts. Again, each of the four parts controlled by each of these four countries over here. Okay, so back to the mind map. Essentially, that was the division of Germany into four main zones. However, like in Yalta, there were disagreements at the Potsdam Conference. For example, the borders of the zones in Germany, there was some dispute over the borders of the zones. Where should we draw the borders? And of course, the amount of reparations that Germany was to pay was also something that they couldn't agree upon. Of course, the Soviet Union would be more demanding, okay, because they had less sympathy for the Germans compared to the British and the French, for example. And in Eastern Europe, the big three, again the USA, Britain, and the Soviet Union, could not agree on the types of government and the extent of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of anger, for example, about Poland being uh, under the Soviets already, simply because a communist government was established in Poland. And the impact of Potsdam was that relations were clearly not smooth, as seen at Potsdam. And for instance, Harry Truman, who was really quite an anti-communist himself, the fact that he took over Roosevelt, who was seen as a more conciliatory person, someone that the Soviets could do more business with, more willing to negotiate, kind of affected relations between the two powers. And because of these tensions that were clearly seen in Potsdam, okay, really showed the differences between the two powers, for example, and how they had different goals and different ideologies. I mean, and it was very clear by the time Potsdam happened that there would be more problems in the future and more areas of tension would surface in the future. Okay, and finally, when we talk about events during World War II, we have the development of the atomic bomb. And when the USA developed the atomic bomb, they didn't actually inform the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union was an ally of the USA. And when it was finally successfully tested in 1945, the Soviet Union actually found out through spies, not through the USA, but through their own spies. And they suspected that the USA, because the USA was so secretive in the way it developed the atomic bomb, they suspected the USA of desiring post-war advantage, okay, for its own self. Okay, and the Soviets, because Stalin was the paranoid guy that he was, they began developing their own atomic bomb, and was eventually successful in 1949. And this, essentially, the impact of this was to begin the arms race between the two superpowers. Okay, and when you have this arms race, basically it turns up the Cold War tensions. Okay, so if we remember, we looked at you know how there was tremendous tension between the superpowers due to the nuclear arms race, and this basically started after 1949, when the Soviet Union managed to develop its own atomic bomb. Right, okay, so that's for the medium-term factors when we look at World War II itself.